Hey guys. So this is a very short lecture on Robert Malthus. The reason that it's short is because he kind of had his life wasn't so interesting. I mean, to me, I'm sure that there are other people. I'm sure Malthus scholars out there are like, oh, he's the most interesting person ever. Have at it. I won't stand in your way. Won't even argue with you. But I do want to. We have to talk about Malthus because he did some important stuff. So this guy was a economist and a social scientist and a demographer, and he was working at the end of the 1700s and the beginning of the 1800s. And he was an Anglican cleric. So he took his religion very seriously. And the reason that I keep bringing stuff back to religion and to God is because when we get to Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace, God and religion are important forces in their life. And historically, the church and religion and um, religious beliefs are foundational to the way these people are working and the way they're publishing. So here we've got this guy, Robert Malthus. He was born upper middle class. He was educated. His family was stable and no strife there. Things that he found strifeful, is that even a word? I'm going to use it anyway. Things that he found strifeful included schools that he loved closed down and he fought to keep them open, which is a nice thing. Okay, but let's talk about him and why he's in my lecture. So he wrote this book in 1798 called An Essay on the Principle of Population. And I think it went through 9 editions. The first one that he wrote, the first edition, he published anonymously. And as was often the case at the time, he was uncovered and they figured out who wrote it. And so he wrote the rest of the editions under his own name. He became an educator in his own right. And his nickname, his students had a nickname, 2 nicknames for him. One was called Pop because he was all about population growth. And the other was Webtoe. I'm going to leave that to your imagination for why that was a nickname for him. I don't know. I didn't try that hard to find out either. Okay, so let's talk about the 1700s in Europe. I know it's the end of the 1700s, but it's still the 1700s. European society had this idea that it was constantly improving and that perfection was possible. Just think about how optimistic that is, right? This is a time where, germ theory is just taking hold. We are just before the Industrial Revolution, but we've recovered from like the Black Death. Population is growing a little bit, a lot in the cities. And one of the things that people like to do, especially using the tools provided by the church, which was a social support system, they tried to enact something called the Poor Laws. And the Poor Laws, you guys are like, how does this have anything to do with anthropology or evolution? But I'm about to tell you. It's kind of interesting. So we got the Poor Laws, and the Poor Laws are meant to support people living in poverty, people who don't have enough food. And he had this argument, Malthus, in this book, An Essay on the Principles of Population, he had this idea that the Poor Laws were really stupid because what would happen is that you could increase food production and you would feed all the people who lived in the ghettos, not that people were using that word yet, the ghettos in the big city, and you would feed them and everybody would get happy and full and they'd quit dying of starvation and famine and all of the diseases associated there within. And then they would have too many babies and the population would then get too big to be supported with what was the allotment in the poor laws. So essentially what he was saying is that, yeah, you can help the poor and they'll be helped, and then they'll have more babies, and then you can't make enough food to feed everybody. And so he was saying that support um, to poor people always led to competition, essentially. He wasn't focused on the competition part. He was focused on the economic and the demography part. This this idea that that feeding the lower class would lead to an increase in population, and an increase in population would lead to more famine and starvation, is called the Malthusian trap, which is kind of a name. And the gist that I want you to take home from this, the point that I want you to take from what I've just said here, is that Malthus published a book that was, oh my gosh, so controversial at the time, and it made him famous, and he stuck to his guns, and he was preaching the same thing for 60 years. But the gist of it, and the part that is important, especially to Darwin and Wallace, both of whom independently read his book, because of course everybody was talking about it, and there were 8 editions of it. So clearly it was an influential book at the time. But they don't care about I'm assuming that Darwin and Wallace, they weren't really particularly interested in the economics, because there's, geometric means and arithmetic means, and which one's bigger and which one's happens with food and which one happens with people. Like, he really did the whole economics thing. But the thing that Wallace and Darwin took home was this idea that populations are going to increase faster than their food supplies do. And that means that there is always going to be competition. And of course,